It's a total body blow for me. Vladimir Kara-Murza was one of my is one of my close friends. He is a true hero of the Russian opposition, and he's now received the longest prison sentence of any Russian political prisoner, 25 years. It's something sort of true evil, what's going on here, and I have just such terrible feelings today about what this means for him, his life, for his family, etc.
It appears that he had spoken out against the war in Ukraine, and that is what has led to these charges.
Well, he's been speaking out against Putin for many years. He was involved in the Magnitsky Act, which is a piece of legislation to freeze assets and ban visas of human rights violators in kleptocrats in Russia. And very recently, he was very openly criticizing the war and Putin's invasion in Ukraine. And so he's kind of got every strike against him from a political standpoint. And as an act of extreme revenge, they've sentenced him to a longer sentence than someone would get even for terrorism in Russia.
You clearly know Mr. Kara-Murza well. He must have been pretty brave to have even spoken out like that, knowing what has happened to so many of the other opponents of the regime, including, of course, Alexei Navalny.
Yeah, well, we don't even understand this kind of bravery because it just doesn't exist in the West. These are people, Vladimir Kara-Murza and Alexei Navalny, who basically have knowingly put their own lives and freedom at risk for the sake of their country. And it's very unusual to see this type of bravery. I was with Vladimir before he left the UK for Russia. I begged him not to go back. I knew how much they hated him there, the regime. And he said, how can I not go back? I want to lead my people to protest this war, to oppose Putin. And how can I do that if I don't go back? I can't be a leader. I can't be a politician, and I can't be a patriot unless I'm going to my own country and leading the people. And for that, now he's facing 25 years in what they call a strict regime, which is like, real hardcore torture prison.
What circumstances do you think he will be held in? I mean, are you worried for his future, given especially what we've heard from Alexei Navalny, who himself has feared that the authorities may be trying to poison him?
Well, in Vladimir's case, the authorities tried to poison him twice. They nearly killed him in 2015 with poison, and the same thing happened in 2017. And so these are people, the government of Russia wants him dead. And so there's every reason to believe that they'll do whatever they have to do while he's in their custody and he doesn't have any control over the situation. So it's a very dangerous and grave situation for him.
It really does appear as though President Putin is just prepared to be utterly ruthless in attempting to suppress any dissent to his leadership and his war in Ukraine.
There's no question that Putin, he has taken all restraining shackles off. He's ready to do everything and anything in order to further his interests. He can't stand anybody who criticizes him. Vladimir has criticized him openly. And in addition to the criticism, he doesn't like the disrespect, the fact that Vladimir wasn't scared of him. And he needed to make an example out of that. And in addition to punishing Vladimir, this is a message for everybody else, which is that if you stand up to Putin, if you criticize the war, your life is effectively over.
What do you think should be the response from international leaders to this? Clearly, we've already got sanctions against Russia. We have already had a widespread international condemnation of the war in Ukraine, huge criticism of what President Putin is doing. But the Russian leader seems to be pretty much impervious to it. And as you have said, just determined to do whatever he needs to do to stop any criticism of what he's up to.
Well, I mean, this is a very specific case. What we should do in this case is that we know the names of all the judges, we know the names of the prosecutors, we know the names of the policemen. They should all be sanctioned individually. That we should make examples out of them in the same way as they're making an example out of Vladimir. To say that if you're involved in this kind of political persecution, you'll never be able to travel to the West again. You'll never be able to open a bank account in the West again. We should do that. And then we should do whatever we can to get this guy out of prison. And we've done this in the past. Nathan Sharansky and Vladimir Bukovsky, all famous Soviet dissidents, the West fought for their release and got their release. And we should do that for Vladimir Kara-Murza. We should do that for Alexei Navalny. And we should do that for many of the other ones.
And do you think leaders like Rishi Sunak in the UK are doing enough to try to arrange for the release of people like this?
No, I don't think that he's doing anything. There was a really embarrassing Foreign Affairs Committee hearing where the head of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Alicia Kearns, asked the Foreign Office Minister, what are you doing about Vladimir Kara-Murza? And he said, I don't know who that is. And I can say from my own experience that I've gone around the world getting Magnitsky sanctions in place for his persecutors, and the Canadians and the Americans have all sanctioned the people involved in the Kara-Murza case, but the British government hasn't, in spite of the fact that Kara-Murza holds a British passport.
So the British authorities, in your view, should be doing more in terms of their response to this?
The British government has completely let Vladimir Kara-Murza down. It's shocking. You know, that just to say that they're concerned about his mistreatment and issuing a few statements doesn't solve the problem. They should sanction the people who did this, and they should use every effort to get him free from jail. I don't see them doing either.
How concerned are you that what Vladimir Putin is doing here is, in his terms, succeeding? I mean, when anyone who dares to speak out against him is imprisoned, locked up, faces some pretty horrendous conditions, clearly it means that many people in his country, even those who hate what he's doing, are simply not prepared to say anything about it.
Yeah, it works completely. And this is the problem. You know, a lot of people say, well, the Russians seem to be supporting Putin in his terrible war. That's just not true. It's just the Russians are too scared. If you face 25 years in a strict regime prison for speaking up against the war, what are you going to do? You're not going to speak up against the war. Only the most heroic people will do that. And this is what a totalitarian regime is all about. And the only thing that we can do in the West to counter this is to make life painful for those people involved in this process with sanctions and other types of penalties.
Everyone, of course, wants the war to end. There are differences of view when it comes to how this can be brought about. We've seen President Xi of China saying that he's got a peace plan, and President Putin's been talking to him. Do you think that we should be prepared to accept some form of ceasefire, some kind of arrangement to try to stop the conflict? Or given what is happening now, do you think it should be an all-out effort to defeat the Russian forces?
Well, first of all, it's not our place to decide what happens to the Ukrainians. It's their decision. And now remember that whatever territory gets occupied by Russia, the women get raped, the men get castrated, and the children get taken away. And so the Ukrainians aren't going to be just saying, "Oh, okay, you can commit genocide in this particular part of Ukraine." No, that's not going to happen, and they're not going to let that happen. And it's not our place to tell them for that to happen. And so at the end of the day, what I can tell you is that the Russians have no intention of backing down and backing off or even negotiating, and nor do the Ukrainians. And so whatever fantasies we have about a ceasefire or ending these hostilities, that's just all stuff we're negotiating in our own head. At the end of the day, these two countries are having it out against each other. Vladimir Putin can't back down, and the Ukrainians aren't going to back down either. And so we have to do whatever we can to support the Ukrainians, because I'll tell you what, if the Ukrainians lose, then the Russians will be at the Estonian border next. And then we have a NATO obligation to protect Estonia. And so we'll be at war with the Russians.